Mace Tyrell stood upon the walls of King's Landing mere hours after the victorious conclusion of the Battle of the Blackwater. For much of the night, he had gazed across the dark waters of the Blackwater rush to where Stannis Baratheon's broken fleet had drifted. The banks were littered with the charred skeletons of ships, the remnants of green fire still dancing along the waves, shimmering ominously as if unwilling to relinquish their deadly hold on the bay. The victory was won, but the city lay uneasy, its people uncertain of what was to come. The stench of smoke and scorched flesh weighed heavily on the air, and the torches on the city walls provided meager reassurance at best. He was tired, oh so very tired, and sweat beaded beneath his crown of thick, curly hair despite the coolness of the night. A victor should feel exultant, he thought. Yet, for all his achievements, Mace Tyrell found himself at a crossroads he had scarcely dared to dream of when he had marched beneath the banner of the Gold Rose. The Lannisters, after all, were not truly loved in King's Landing. Not by its people, not by the armies who had fought, and, he suspected, not even by their bannermen who whispered behind closed doors. The Lannisters wielded gold and fear in equal measure, but gold and fear were poor glues to hold a fractured realm together. He told himself that the Tyrell name, in contrast, might bring a gentler, more prosperous promise to the crown. The Golden Rose had always symbolized bounty, fertility, and stability. Why should that symbol not grace the Iron Throne? In truth, Mace Tyrell harbored a brand of ambition few suspected, sheltered as he was behind his often boisterous manners. Many saw only a paunchy, middle-aged man with a genial laugh and a taste for feasts. But he had grown more reflective in the aftermath of Renly Baratheon's death and the near ruin of the realm. If the Tyrells continued to play second fiddle to the Lannisters, in time, House Tyrell might find itself overshadowed. They had always been second or third in the eyes of other great houses. Aegon the Conqueror had humbled the gardeners, and the Tyrells were the stewards who rose from caretaker to lordship of the Reach. Perhaps that hint of leftover condescension still lingered among the old families of the land. But the Tyrells were in truth one of the greatest powers in Westeros, boasting vast armies, fertile fields, and wealthy domains. No longer did Mace wish to see his family bend the knee to a boy king whose claim and whose temperament left so much to be desired. He turned to Ser Loras, the Knight of Flowers, who stood at his side in battered yet resplendent armor, the plumage of his helm singed away by wildfire. Loras's face was drawn, eyes hardened by grief over Renly's end but glimmering with a resolute pride in the Tyrell name. "We have won a great victory," Mace said softly, conscious that the walls had ears. "You fought bravely, my son." Loras looked out into the night, toward the battered remnants of the foe they had beaten back. He had always been quick to speak in Renly's name. But now it was Mace Tyrell who commanded his loyalty, and perhaps his hope. "We have done what we came to do. The city is saved. For now." That mild response made Mace's lips twitch. He sensed that Loras had not yet fully recovered from his heartbreak over Renly's demise, but there was an eagerness in the younger man too, a readiness for another cause to champion. Renly had promised a shining new dawn for the realm. Mace told himself that the Tyrells might yet deliver on that promise, though in their own way. He took one last look at the battered bay and made for the staircase, carefully descending toward the yard below. If anyone saw him, they would see only the Lord of Highgarden who had come to inspect the walls. The soldiers still patrolled, and the gold cloaks who had not turned cloak to Stannis were wide-eyed with fear and exhaustion. The stench of smoke and death had become almost an ambient haze that hung over everything. Step by step, Mace descended, mindful that each step might bring him closer to the greatest gamble of his life. At the foot of the stairs, he found Lady Olenna awaiting him. The Queen of Thorns, as she was named. She was garbed in a more practical gown than usual, her thin lips pressed in something close to amusement as she watched guards and servants bustle about. Her eyes shone with the sort of keenness that Mace had always found both reassuring and intimidating in equal measure. "Worry not, dear son," she said in a dry, low tone that only he could hear. "No one of any importance suspects anything yet. Most of the city is still trembling over the wildfire and praising the Seven that their homes aren't ashes." Mace's face quivered with tension, but he forced a pleasant smile. "I worry about stepping too far, too quickly," he admitted in a hushed murmur. "Tywin Lannister will return any day now, and he'll expect gratitude. He will demand that we reaffirm our pledge to King Joffrey." Olenna raised a hand to hush him. "Tywin Lannister is many things, but he is no fool. He knows we hold the breadbasket of the entire continent, and he knows our swords turned the tide tonight. But he also knows that the Lannister hold on the throne grows more tenuous by the day. If you are to act, you must do so swiftly, before Tywin solidifies his grip on young Joffrey and the city. With the right maneuvers, half of these soldiers patrolling the gates might decide the Tyrell Rose is the safer bet." Mace was not as quick-witted as Olenna, but he understood enough to see the window that had opened before him. The people of the city might be swayed by bread and the promise of mercy, two things that the Lannisters, after the fiasco of starving crowds and rumors of incest, were ill-equipped to provide. "I will consider your counsel," he said, his voice faintly trembling with anticipation. "Pray we do not move in error." The Queen of Thorns regarded him for a long moment. Then she placed a hand on his arm. "Marjorie is waiting in the solar. You should speak with her too. She has a clear head, that girl." The mention of Marjorie reminded Mace of what his daughter had already weathered. She had been wed to Renly, had lost him, and had traveled swiftly to offer her hand in marriage to King Joffrey, all to cement the alliance that allowed this very victory. How quickly that plan had sprung from the cunning of Littlefinger, who in turn aimed to curry favor with the Tyrells. But was that reason enough to remain tethered to the Lannisters now that the dust of battle had settled? Mace nodded, parted from his mother, and made his way to the solar. Highgarden men-at-arms stood guard at every turn, their presence a reminder that the Tyrell host had a strong foothold in the city. The Lannisters might claim victory from the walls, but many of the soldiers who had risked their lives in those flaming waters bore the golden rose upon their breast. Inside the solar, candles flickered, throwing dancing shadows across Marjorie's face. She was seated in a high-backed wooden chair, her posture poised, her expression calm. She looked up as her father entered and offered him a small smile. "Father," she said quietly, "you look weary. Sit." Her voice, always so gentle and measured, held the soft lilt of a hostess greeting a guest to a small feast. He took a seat opposite her, noticing the tray of small, honey-drizzled tarts on the table between them. Marjorie, always the gracious one, had prepared a semblance of courtesy even here, on this night of blood and smoke. He picked up a tart without thinking, but his appetite was fleeting. Instead, he held it, turning it between his fingers as though it were the key to some puzzle. "Marjorie," he began in a slow, thoughtful tone, "you have seen the state of the city. The Lannisters claim a total victory, but I see the cracks in their foundation. These people starve, Joffrey is more a viper than a king, and the realm is fracturing in a dozen directions. Tywin Lannister is the only real pillar holding up that boy's reign." Marjorie's eyes flickered. She glanced at the door, mindful that even thick doors might harbor listeners. Then her voice came in a low, even whisper. "I have spoken with some of the ladies, father, and I can tell you that the city hates Cersei and Joffrey. Tyrion Lannister, on the other hand, earned a kind of reluctant admiration after he led the defense, but that is overshadowed by the memory of the bread riots. And so many still starve, even after tonight." She leaned forward, resting her slender hands on her lap. If a new power rose, a power with the means to feed them, to offer stability and hope, the city could be swayed, especially if that power offered a gentler face than the Lannisters do. Mace heard in her words an echo of his mother's counsel. Gently, he set the tart down, half regretting that he had not eaten it. His mouth felt dry. "You know, I have considered it. Usurping the throne is a terrifying leap. The Targaryen claim, the Baratheon claim. The great houses have turned the realm into a battlefield. If the Tyrells join in a scramble for the throne, how many will see us as no better than the rest?" Marjorie's expression was pensive. "We would need the faith support, the High Septon in particular. In the eyes of the small folk, the right blessing can make a king legitimate. We would need an understanding with the other great houses, or at least enough of them to appear as if we have consensus. The Stormlands might bend easily if we offer them concessions, for their loyalty to Stannis is in tatters. The Reach is ours. The Riverlands are weary of Lannister occupation. The North, that is a complicated matter with Robb Stark claiming kingship. Yet perhaps we could negotiate. She lifted her gaze to study her father's reaction. Father, I do not speak of conquest. I speak of forging a real peace. Let the Lannisters remain in Casterly Rock if they wish. Let them keep their gold. But in King's Landing, let there be a king and a queen who can bring bounty back to this realm. The glimmer in her eye suggested an idea taking shape. Mace realized, with a faint flush of pride, just how quick Marjorie's mind worked. She had always been adept at forging alliances, reading people, playing her part in grand designs. She was telling him, in her understated way, that she would be prepared to stand as queen if Mace Tyrell claimed the crown. He breathed in, trying to calm the flutter in his chest. For years, he had allowed others to tease that Mace Tyrell was but a loud, feasting lord with illusions of grandeur. But if he truly took the crown, he would be more than that, and so would his children. More importantly, House Tyrell would be more than wardens of a single region. They would be the seat of the monarchy. Before he could speak further, there came a soft rap at the door. Mace motioned, and a guard opened it. Ser Garland Tyrell stepped through, removing his helm. The eldest of Mace's sons, Garland was steady and measured where Loras was brilliant but impulsive. Tall, broad-shouldered, and even-tempered, Garland brought a certain calming presence to any room. He inclined his head to Marjorie, then turned to Mace. Father, Grand Maester Pycelle awaits you in the throne room. He seems to have some message. Also, there's talk that Joffrey has roused himself for a ceremony to mark the victory. Mace rose, smoothing the front of his doublet. I cannot refuse to attend, he said. Not yet. Let Joffrey have his victory display. But if Pycelle has a message, be sure we weigh every word carefully. Garland nodded, though a flicker of disapproval crossed his features. In truth, none of the Tyrells seemed especially fond of Joffrey, who had proven himself capricious and cruel at every turn. Still, for the moment, they needed to maintain appearances. Marjorie stood, moving to join them. She placed a careful hand on Garland's arm. Brother, do you sense that the Lannisters might already be maneuvering to sideline us? They do not like to share their victories. Garland pursed his lips. There is no sign yet, but Cersei's look was sour enough to curdle milk when the soldiers started chanting our house words. I will not be surprised if we find ourselves confronted with demands that we reaffirm Joffrey's betrothal to you, Marjorie, or confirm some new arrangement. We must keep our eyes open. Marjorie nodded and let her hand fall away from her brother's arm. She glanced at her father. Go then, father. Meet with Pycelle, watch Joffrey's little ceremony. We will see which way the winds blow. Mace allowed himself a small nod of agreement, squared his shoulders, and followed Garland out of the solar. Yet, in the back of his mind, the notion of the Iron Throne loomed ever larger. His mother and daughter had planted the seeds, and Mace Tyrell could not help but feel the first stirring of an aspiration that threatened to burn away any caution he had clung to thus far. They walked through the torchlit corridors of the Red Keep. The walls bore marks from previous conflicts, scorches from the wildfire that had nearly consumed the city, and cracks that told of older strife. Guards stood at intervals, half in Lannister red, half in Tyrell green and gold, an uneasy tapestry of the alliance that had just saved King's Landing. Servants scurried to and fro with bandages, water jugs, and scraps of food to feed the wounded. Outside the castle windows, muffled cries of the injured carried on the night breeze. In the grand throne room, Lord Tywin Lannister had not yet arrived from Harrenhal, but his presence was felt in the stoic hostility of the Lannister knights who lined the hall. At the far end, on the Iron Throne itself, perched King Joffrey Baratheon, though one glance at him confirmed that any true kingly bearing was absent. His face was pale, and though he was dressed in regal finery, he wore his fear like a cloak. He still had not recovered from cowering behind the city walls while others fought for his life and his seat of power. Grand Maester Pycelle waited, hands clasped before him. The old man's beard quivered as he caught sight of Mace Tyrell and beckoned him closer. On the dais, Joffrey was mid-speech, addressing a small gathering of lords and ladies who had been hastily summoned to witness a new round of honors. A battered Tyrion Lannister stood off to one side, leaning on a cane, his face bruised from the blow that had nearly ended his life during the fighting. Cersei hovered at the edge of the dais, flanked by her guards. She did not look pleased to see Mace approach. As Mace advanced, he heard Joffrey proclaim, "My mother and my advisors tell me that I should show gratitude to those who fought for the city. Ser Loras Tyrell, approach." Joffrey's voice wavered, as though the idea of sharing glory with anyone else grated at his pride. Loras moved forward, kneeling gracefully before the Iron Throne. Joffrey brandished a thin sword. "Ser Loras, I name you to the Kingsguard." The boy king's eyes flicked about the crowd. "A fitting honor for one who was the greatest knight in all our battles." Cersei allowed herself a flicker of a smile. By elevating Loras to the Kingsguard, Joffrey made him swear vows of celibacy and ultimate loyalty, an attempt to bind House Tyrell to the throne. Mace felt a stab of alarm. The Lannisters hoped to tie them down with these honors, ensuring the Tyrells could not easily break away. Loras bowed his head, but he said nothing. He had long nursed the dream of joining the Kingsguard, especially in the days when Renly had been hailed as a would-be king. Now the vow took on a bitter taste, perhaps, but Loras kept his face impassive. The white cloak was draped over his shoulders. Polite applause rustled through the gathered onlookers. Joffrey continued, "And Margaery Tyrell, who was to wed my dear, departed Uncle Renly. She has shown her devotion to our cause by coming to us in our time of need. I declare my intention to wed her as soon as may be arranged." He glanced at his mother. Cersei nodded slightly, the corners of her mouth twisting up in a cool, triumphant smile. Mace Tyrell moved forward. He sensed that all eyes were upon him. This was the moment to bend the knee, to say that House Tyrell was honored. But the weight of his own ambition, and the knowledge of what his mother and daughter had said, pressed at him. For a fleeting instant, he considered defying Joffrey right here and now. He pictured the outraged shouts of the Lannister guards, the drawn swords, the confusion in the hall. It would be chaos, a spree of violence, a gamble that might lead to his own death. Instead, Mace forced a smile. "Your Grace," he said, bending his knee but only briefly. "House Tyrell is honored by your favor. My daughter shall make a most graceful and devoted queen." He stood, letting his voice carry through the hall. "We are but servants to the crown, though I hope we may all serve a united realm, strong and secure." He saw Cersei's narrowed gaze, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. Perhaps she noticed the edge in his voice, or perhaps she merely distrusted all who did not bear the name Lannister. Joffrey seemed oblivious, as always, too enamored with the ceremonial aspect of his own declarations to perceive the nuance of Mace's words. Grand Maester Pycelle sidled up to Mace then, motioning him toward a side corridor. Mace exchanged a quick glance with Garland, who hovered protectively behind him, and followed the ancient maester out of the throne room. Pycelle led him past several guards until they reached a small antechamber, where 2 Tyrell soldiers stood watch. Pycelle cleared his throat, stroking his long white beard. "My lord," he wheezed, "I bring a message from the King's Council. They would request that you arrange for additional food supplies to be sent from the Reach at once. The city is in dire need, and the people must be fed if they are to remain calm." He paused, letting out a shaky breath. "Furthermore, I am told that should you be gracious in this time of necessity, His Grace will be most grateful. Perhaps certain new lands or titles might be bestowed. I do not speak for the king, of course, but—" He trailed off as Mace stared at him. So this was the next step of the Lannister plan, to drain the Reach of its resources to feed King's Landing, then dangle new honors as a reward. Mace's lips compressed. He thought of his mother's words. This was precisely what he had expected. The Lannisters needed Tyrell grain, Tyrell gold, Tyrell soldiers. But they would never truly trust the Tyrells, nor would they ever share real power. He inclined his head. Of course, Grand Maester, the Tyrells will do our utmost to provide for the city. This is our duty, and we shall not shirk it. His tone was friendly, his smile mild, but inside, his resolve solidified. If the Lannisters sought to tie them closer, it meant they felt their hold slipping. Mace intended to use that. In the meantime, I pray we strengthen the bond between our houses, for the good of the realm. Of course, Pycelle said, waddling slightly as he bowed. I will relay your words to the King's Council. Such loyalty will not go unrewarded, my lord. Mace thanked him and left, Garland close behind. As they returned to the corridors, Garland said in a hushed tone, They are going to exploit our resources, father, all while tying Loras to their side and wedding Joffrey to Marjorie. This is what they want, our swords, our grain, and our loyalty. But nothing more. Mace nodded gravely. We must proceed carefully. If we act rashly, we could bring ruination upon our house. But if we are patient, if we gather enough support, then we make a move that secures our place at the top. Garland's face was thoughtful as they continued along the corridor. What would you have me do? Gather information, Mace said. Discreetly. We need to know who in the Red Keep might be swayed to our side, and who stands firmly with the Lannisters. Also, see if you can speak with men from the City Watch. If they sense we have the means to feed them and pay them, they might be more amenable to a change in leadership. I will speak with the High Septon soon. Mother will see to that. Garland nodded, the possibility of forging a new path lighting his eyes. Mace felt a twinge of excitement. They were truly preparing for something momentous. When they emerged into a courtyard, the smell of char and blood greeted them once more. Wounded men lay on pallets, moaning softly, while Septons and Maesters attended them as best they could. Mace breathed in the harsh air, reminding himself that King's Landing was both battered and volatile. Tonight, the Tyrells were hailed as saviors. Tomorrow, who knew? They departed the Red Keep, crossing a short bridge that led to an outer ward. There, in a modest suite that had been hastily allocated to the Tyrells, they found Lady Olenna once again, this time in conversation with a squire who stammered over a tale of a riot in Flea Bottom. Olenna dismissed him curtly and turned to greet Mace and Garland. Her eyes flicked to the closed door behind them, ensuring privacy. Well? She demanded, arms folded. What did the boy king want? Mace recounted the ceremony, the news of Loras's induction into the King's Guard, Joffrey's public declaration of marriage to Marjorie, and Pycelle's request for more food shipments from the Reach. Olenna's mouth tightened in a grim line with each piece of information. So they want to squeeze us, she concluded, and we will provide for the moment, but we must accelerate our plans. She tapped her staff against the floor. We have an advantage. The people of King's Landing will soon see us as the ones preventing another great famine, not the Lannisters. Every loaf they taste will be courtesy of the Reach. That is the key to winning hearts, especially of the small folk. And the small folks' hearts can be a shield against the Lannisters. Garland hesitated. The small folk are powerless in the face of knights and lords. Is that not so? Powerless on the battlefield, perhaps, Olenna said. But a city in revolt can bring down a monarchy, or at least weaken it to the point of no return. And if the Gold Cloaks or the City Watch side with that revolt, well, that is the end of Lannister rule. She looked to Mace. We should press this advantage and begin to woo the lords as well. Many find Tywin Lannister's name intimidating, but if you show them that Tywin's gold does not outweigh Tyrell resources and Tyrell alliances, they may flock to our cause. Mace sighed, tension knotting his shoulders. He was a lord, yes, but never before had he orchestrated a potential coup. He had placed his trust in Renly's short-lived cause. Now he had to be the driving force behind his own. We must step carefully. For now, we pledge our open loyalty to Joffrey and the Lannisters, but quietly, behind the scenes, we build our coalition. We need the Stormlands. We need to neutralize the Baratheons, or perhaps bring them in. Stannis is nearly beaten, but not quite. We also must watch what becomes of King Rob in the north." Olenna sniffed. "The boy in the north is stubborn, but with the right enticements, he might prefer an end to the war that has left his home ravaged by Ironborn on the coasts and Lannisters in the Riverlands. Perhaps we can promise the North greater autonomy. A royal decree or two might buy their neutrality, if not their active support." Thus began the days of delicate dance in King's Landing, with Mace Tyrell smiling and feasting in public, always praising King Joffrey and Queen Cersei, while in private he sent out riders with secret letters. Garland and Loras quietly befriended key members of the City Watch, distributing small purses of gold and promising more once the harvest shipments started arriving. Marjorie, under the guise of charity, visited the poorest parts of King's Landing, handing out bread and honey cakes. Though the guards and local septs attributed her generosity to the crown, the common folk knew who truly fed them. Whisper by whisper, the name Tyrell became associated with mercy, plenty, and hope. In these same weeks, the tension between Tyrell and Lannister soared beneath the surface. Tyrion Lannister, recovered enough to walk about with a cane, observed the Tyrell efforts to supply bread. He guessed at their motivations but found no immediate recourse, as the city did need the grain. Cersei glowered from behind her walls of courtiers, occasionally ordering some Tyrell men-at-arms to stand aside at public events to remind them who ostensibly ruled the city. Joffrey played the king in front of Marjorie, but beneath the veneer of courtly gestures, his cruelty simmered, and Marjorie's careful smiles did not go unnoticed by those who read the subtle lines of her face and realized she was playing a part. One morning, weeks after the battle, Marjorie and Joffrey were walking in the gardens of the Red Keep. A handful of the King's Guard accompanied them, including Loras, who trailed a few paces back, silent and watchful. Marjorie wore a gown of pale green, embroidered with small golden roses. Joffrey, in contrast, was garbed in black velvet accented with gold. The young king was gesturing at the practice yard below, bragging about how he personally would have routed Stannis's men if not for his mother's instructions to remain safely in the city. Marjorie listened with a serene expression, occasionally offering remarks like, "Oh, your grace is too valiant." She subtly guided him toward the western edge of the garden, where the vantage overlooked Flea Bottom. Below, the cramped buildings stood haphazardly, with scrawny children darting through alleys, and thin-limbed men and women trudging about their daily errands. Joffrey grimaced at the sight, his hand instinctively going to the pommel of his sword, as though the very view offended him. "They should clean up that wretched place," he said irritably. "Perhaps burn it if it cannot be cleaned. My father, the late King Robert, would never have tolerated such filth." Marjorie's hand tightened on the stone railing. She forced a gentle, admonishing laugh. "Your Grace, these are your people. Without them, who would do the work of the city? Who would fill your armies?" She let her voice carry a note of empathy. "As king, is it not your duty to protect and guide them so that they might prosper under your reign?" His brow furrowed. "They are lazy and ungrateful. They spat at me not long ago. They starve, then they blame me. But if they only worked—" She laid a soothing hand upon his arm, cutting him off in a way that was almost maternal. "Sometimes the people need a generous hand, not a harsh one. The Tyrells have begun distributing bread to ease their suffering. That goodwill reflects upon you, your Grace, because we do it in your name. They begin to see you as a savior of the city." Joffrey's chest puffed up slightly at the mention of being seen as a savior. "Well," he said, somewhat mollified, "if they are grateful, let them know it is because of my betrothed's graciousness. I will see if I can spare them a few words of encouragement at the next feast." He sounded as though the idea bored him already. Marjorie repressed the urge to roll her eyes. Instead, she offered a radiant smile. "I am sure they will be overjoyed, your Grace." All the while, Loras watched his sister's performance from a step behind. His face was inscrutable, though he burned with the memory of the man he had loved, Renly, and the cheapness of Joffrey's posturing. He comforted himself with the thought that perhaps his father's plan would remove Joffrey from the throne, sooner rather than later. Though he was sworn as a Kingsguard knight, His oath might be tested if the realm embraced a different king altogether. That night, in a remote corner of the Red Keep's library, where dusty tomes on horticulture and genealogies kept quiet company, Mace Tyrell met with none other than Peter Baelish Littlefinger. The master of coin, as always, wore a sly smile and a mocking glint in his eyes. He had arranged the meeting under the pretext of wanting to discuss finances for the wedding feast. Yet Mace suspected more was at play. Baelish spoke first. "My Lord Tyrell, how good of you to join me. I am putting together numbers for the crown's wedding expenses. With war still raging, we must be prudent, mustn't we?" He gave a charmingly false look of concern, as if cost-cutting for a royal wedding was an act of selfless leadership rather than cunning. Mace folded his arms across his chest, the library's shadows making his face appear more severe. "Prudent," he repeated. "Yes, the crown has many debts, does it not? To House Lannister, to the Iron Bank, and perhaps even to the Reach if we continue to send supplies on credit." Baelish's lips twitched. An astute observation. Indeed, the crown's finances teeter on the brink. But that also means the Lannisters teeter with it, for their fortunes are tied to the throne's success. Or so everyone believes. Mace narrowed his eyes. "Is there a point to this conversation, Lord Baelish?" Baelish stepped closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hush. "Only that I sense the shifting of alliances, my lord. The realm is exhausted from bloodshed, from tyranny, from unpredictability. The Lannisters stand as the face of all three in the eyes of many. Yet for now they are the official power. But should that power falter, well, chaos is a ladder, as some might say." He gave a faint shrug, never losing that smile. Mace swallowed, aware that Baelish was the one who had traveled to Highgarden initially to propose the Tyrell-Lannister alliance in the aftermath of Renly's death. Now, was he offering to shift sides yet again? A wave of distaste washed over Mace. He disliked men who changed allegiances as easily as one might change a cloak. But sometimes, necessity demanded unsavory allies. "You have something in mind, Lord Baelish?" Baelish tapped his fingertips together. "I only suggest that if some new ruler were to step forward, someone who could unite a war-torn realm, then certain channels in the capital might be open to that ruler's advantage. The gold cloaks, certain officials, certain illusions that can be created or dispelled with coin and cunning." He paused, letting Mace infer the rest. "And in return, that new ruler might see fit to name a new master of coin, perhaps a new Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, or any of a host of other positions that might be negotiated." Mace felt a sour taste in his mouth. Baelish was naming his price. Mace had no desire to reward a man so slippery, but in the games of power, the highest seat often required deals with lesser devils. "I will keep your words in mind," Mace managed. He turned and walked away, pretending not to see the flicker of triumph on Baelish's face. The man was an opportunist of the highest order, but perhaps the Tyrell cause would be stronger for using him as well. By the time Mace returned to his family's chambers, he found them gathered around a table, with maps of Westeros spread out. Olenna, Garland, Marjorie, and even Loras, briefly excused from his Kingsguard duties for a private supper, stood in a hush as Mace recounted Baelish's veiled offer of help. Olenna sniffed disapproval. "Littlefinger is a snake. He'll turn on us just as quickly if a better offer comes his way." Marjorie's eyes narrowed with thought. "But for now, he holds power over the city's finances, and he has contact with many of the city watch. He might help orchestrate a swift transition if we position ourselves as the rightful rulers. Perhaps we can tie him with promises, something that keeps him loyal." Loras rested his hand on the pommel of his sword. "If it were up to me, I'd toss him in the Blackwater. But I suppose we do need him, at least for the short term." Mace stared at the map. "The truth is, we need more than just the city. If we can bring the Stormlands under our banner, truly not in name only, then we control all the lands surrounding King's Landing. The ships of the Reach and the Arbor can blockade Blackwater Bay if needed. Meanwhile, we must also secure an understanding with the North and the Riverlands. They fight the Lannisters, but they do not necessarily welcome a Tyrell on the throne. Garland nodded. We could propose an end to hostilities and a release of their prisoners in exchange for their neutrality or even fealty. If Robb Stark wants the North to remain free of Southern meddling, let's promise him that. We can always treat him as a warden of the North, so long as he acknowledges Tyrell rule. Loras added, As for Dorne, they hate the Lannisters for the deaths of Elia Martell and her children. We might offer them justice if we hold the city. Let them rejoin the realm under a Tyrell king, who punishes the Lannisters and Gregor Clegane for their crimes. Olenna's fingers drummed on the table. There remains the matter of the Targaryen girl rumored to be across the Narrow Sea. But that might be a problem for another day. If we can seize the throne now, we can deal with her if and when she appears. The plan grew clearer. Mace looked at each of his children. They were all so committed, so ready to see the Golden Rose take center stage. Their determination emboldened him. Then let us continue to prepare. We will feed the city, gather supporters, approach the Stormlords with bribes. Let the Lannisters cling to their illusions for just a while longer. And when the moment is right, we will strike. The days that followed were filled with clandestine meetings. The Tyrell caravans rolled into King's Landing bearing grain, fruit, and even barrels of arbor wine. The hungry small folk saw the bounty and murmured their thanks to House Tyrell. The name Lannister was increasingly spat upon in the alleys for being absent or aloof in their time of need. Margaery's charitable visits became near legendary in the slums. Joffrey, to his frustration, received only tepid thanks when he appeared in public, overshadowed by his betrothed's calm, generous presence. Word came that Tywin Lannister would return to King's Landing soon, having marched out to confront Robb Stark. Meanwhile, Stannis Baratheon licked his wounds at Dragonstone, rumored to be seeking new allies or some kind of dark magic to renew his quest. Mace quietly sent ravens to certain Stormlords who had not fully thrown their lot in with Stannis, offering them lands and gold in exchange for open Tyrell support. He also corresponded with sympathetic lords in the Reach who had followed him to King's Landing, asking them to swear to muster additional men if called. Margaery arranged for the High Septon to attend special prayers at the Great September of Baelor, prayers for the relief of the city's suffering. When the throngs of small folk arrived, each found a small loaf of bread waiting for them, courtesy of House Tyrell. The High Septon blessed the Tyrell name in his sermon, praising their generosity and praising Margaery as a true daughter of the faith. The king's name was mentioned, yes, but in a cursory, obligatory manner. The seeds of a new loyalty were being sown in the hearts of the faithful. Cersei grew wary. She complained to Joffrey that the Tyrells were overshadowing him, that they sought to upstage the crown. Joffrey, petulant and easily swayed, demanded that Margaery scale back her charity events, claiming it was making the city look weak. Margaery placated him with gentle words and coaxed him into forgetting the matter by praising his skill at the archery butts. Yet the friction between Lannister and Tyrell was beginning to spark. One afternoon, Ser Loras found himself confronted by Cersei in a corridor near the royal apartments. Cersei, flanked by 2 Lannister guards, eyed him coldly. "My son has heard disturbing rumors that the Gold Cloaks are receiving bribes from your father. He does not believe it, nor do I, but it is a rumor worth dispelling. Tell me, Ser Loras, is your house as loyal to the crown as it claims?" Loras's jaw tightened. He bowed stiffly. "We have pledged our swords to the king, your grace. My father and I have done nothing but serve." He did not address the rumor directly, which only seemed to heighten Cersei's suspicions. Cersei stepped closer, her green eyes fierce. "Do not think me blind, boy. I see how your sister manipulates Joffrey with her charms. I see how the small folk fawn over your father's bread shipments. We Lannisters are not so easily cast aside." Loras swallowed his anger, remembering his sworn duty as a Kingsguard knight, despite his father's covert ambitions. "Your grace," he said tersely, "we are at war. Unity is paramount. We supply food to keep the city from starving. It is not a crime to feed the hungry." She stared at him, assessing him as one might a dangerous animal. Then she laughed softly, a brittle sound. "Keep your illusions if you like, Ser Loras." Just remember who holds the throne at this moment, and who is poised to punish disloyalty." With that, she swept away, her guards trailing after. Loras exhaled slowly. He felt the tension rise in him like a wave. He wondered how long they could maintain the charade. How long until open conflict erupted in the Red Keep itself. The tension escalated again when Tywin Lannister finally returned to King's Landing in a flourish of armor and banners. The haggard remains of his host marched through the city gates. The small folk watched in sullen silence, some still wearing the golden roses that Marjorie had given them. Word spread that Tywin had faced Robb Stark yet again but had failed to crush him outright. Tywin arrived with a grin set to his mouth, as if the realm's unraveling weighed heavily on his shoulders. In the courtyard of the Red Keep, Tywin dismounted from his warhorse. Immediately, courtiers rushed to greet him. Joffrey stood on a small dais to welcome his grandfather, while Cersei, smiling through her teeth, offered a short bow. Mace Tyrell stood at a distance, arms folded behind his back, his expression carefully neutral. Tywin's cold, pale eyes swept over him for a fleeting moment. There was no cordial greeting, only a curt nod of acknowledgement. Mace felt the unspoken challenge in that glance. Tywin was sizing him up, suspecting, perhaps rightly, that Mace had grown too powerful in his absence. That evening, Tywin convened a small council meeting. Mace Tyrell attended along with Cersei, Tyrion, Baelish, Varys, and Pycelle. Joffrey was conspicuously absent, as he often preferred to leave ruling to others whenever it bored him. Tywin took his seat at the head of the table, the flicker of candles illuminating his rigid features. Tywin wasted no time. There are troubling reports that certain lords in the Reach, House Fossaway and House Meadows among them, have withheld some of their harvest shipments to the crown. I assume, Lord Tyrell, that you are aware of this. The city cannot suffer further shortages. Mace spread his hands, feigning a look of mild concern. I will look into it, my lord. I suspect it is simply a matter of logistics. Our men are stretched thin, ensuring bandits do not seize the harvest on the roads. If the shipments are delayed, rest assured we will compensate for it with extra supplies soon. Tywin's gaze drilled into him. See that you do. We cannot allow any sign of weakness. We have already had reports of restless commoners. Should they sense the crown cannot feed them, they will riot. And that will cost us more than gold. Mace inclined his head. House Tyrell stands ready to ensure stability in the realm, my lord. He let the words hang. The implication, House Tyrell and not House Lannister, held the means to keep the capital fed. Cersei noticed the barb. Her fingers tapped irritably on the table. Tyrion watched them both, eyes darting, calculating. Baelish gave a small, knowing smirk. Varys blinked, hands folded within voluminous sleeves, giving away nothing. Tywin turned the discussion to the war effort. The Ironborn had taken key ports in the north, while Robb Stark remained elusive. Stannis was rumored to be rebuilding his strength. The crown's coffers were dangerously low. Tywin turned to Baelish, demanding solutions for raising new funds. Baelish demurred, claiming the crown could borrow more from Bravos if they made a show of stability. After the meeting ended, Tywin approached Mace directly while the others filtered out. Only Tyrion lingered, as if to observe. Tywin spoke in a low, measured tone. I am not blind to the ways you have ingratiated yourself to the people of King's Landing. They call you a savior. But let me be clear, the Lannisters hold the throne. My grandson is king. The Tyrell name is an honored ally, not an equal, and certainly not a rival. He paused, eyes glittering like cold steel. Do not forget your place. Mace felt his pulse hammering in his ears, but he managed to smile thinly. We do what we must for the good of the realm, Lord Tywin. Nothing more. Tywin's gaze stayed upon him for a moment longer before he turned and left, followed by Tyrion, who cast Mace a speculative glance over his shoulder. Mace exhaled. If there had been any lingering doubts, they were dispelled. Tywin Lannister would brook no rising star, no potential threat to his family's domination. If Mace did nothing, the Tyrells would eventually be undermined, weakened, or forced into subservience. The time to act was approaching fast. Within days of Tywin's return, a new wave of letters went out under Tyrell seals, carried by trusted messengers. Some were bound for the Stormlands, some for Dorne, some for the scattered lords of the Reach still at home. Mace dispatched secret envoys to the Riverlands, offering a truce and relief from Lannister oppression if they would support, or at least not oppose, an alternative to Joffrey. Meanwhile, Olenna secured an audience with the High Septon to discuss the moral crisis of the realm and the need for a strong, virtuous monarchy. Baelish continued to slip Mace bits of intelligence regarding the gold cloaks, many of whom were open to higher pay. It was Garland who brought news that might tip the balance. "Father," he said excitedly one morning, "we have word from Storm's End. The garrison there is weak. Many of Renly's old bannermen are chafing under the idea of Stannis's claim. They might very well open the gates if we give them reason enough, and if we promise them a proper overlord who respects their traditions." Mace's heart quickened. Storm's End was the key to controlling the Stormlands, a bastion that had never fallen but for treachery or siege. If Storm's End pledged itself to the Tyrells, it would be a massive blow to any who claimed the Iron Throne through Baratheon blood. It might also block Stannis from regaining momentum. He turned to Olenna and Marjorie, who listened intently. "If we secure Storm's End without bloodshed, the rest of the Stormlands might fall in line. That would give us a ring around King's Landing. We could isolate the Lannisters." Olenna nodded briskly. "Send word to our loyal captains. They should move discreetly. We don't want Tywin suspecting that we are massing troops near the city." That very night, Mace composed a letter to the Castellan of Storm's End, forging a new alliance. He promised that when the time came, Storm's End would receive men, supplies, and a portion of the spoils if they rose for House Tyrell. He also assured them that any loyalty to Renly's memory would be honored, for the Tyrells had followed Renly once themselves. The letter concluded with a flourish of Mace's personal seal. Days blurred into nights. Mace donned a mask of cordiality at every royal feast, praising Joffrey's reign with feigned enthusiasm, while inside, he steeled himself for the blow that would inevitably come. The Lannisters were not idle either. Tywin pressed for more shipments, more men. He began reassigning gold cloaks he did not trust, rotating them out to the war front in the Riverlands. But Baelish and Marjorie managed to funnel enough coin to the key captains that the command structure remained friendly to House Tyrell. Then, at last, a raven arrived from Storm's End. The Castellan confirmed that the fortress was prepared to welcome Tyrell men. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Mace as he stood in the solar with the letter in hand. Olenna, Marjorie, Loras, and Garland gathered around him. "This is it, then," Mace murmured. "Our chance. Once Storm's End is ours, we can make our move. Tywin might try to muster the Lannister forces, but if the City Watch is on our side, we can seize King's Landing from within. We can demand Joffrey's abdication, or, if he resists—" He did not finish the thought. Marjorie's face was pale but set in determination. Loras exhaled, raking a hand through his curled hair. Garland moved to the window, gazing out at the city lights. Olenna simply nodded, as if this had been inevitable all along. Mace sealed a second set of orders and dispatched them with a messenger to the Tyrell camp outside the city walls, instructing them to move a contingent south in the next week to take Storm's End. They were to move at night in small groups to avoid suspicion. Another set of messengers would go to certain lords in the Reach, advising them to move closer to King's Landing under the pretext of rotating in fresh troops. The net was quietly closing. The final piece came late one afternoon, when Marjorie informed her father that the High Septon would be making a public pronouncement in front of the Great September the next day. The rumor was that he intended to speak on the righteous path for the realm. Mace suspected it might be a subtle endorsement of the Tyrell cause, or at least a critique of Joffrey's monstrous behaviors. If that occurred, the mood of the entire city could shift at once. Mace decided that would be the moment to set their plan in motion. "We must be ready to act as soon as the High Septon speaks," he told Garland and Loras. "If the faith blesses our cause publicly, the people will rally to us. We'll control the City Watch. will present Joffrey and Cersei with terms. Surrender or be taken. Tywin will be powerless to stop us if the city itself rises against him. In the hush of their final war council, Olenna gazed at Mace with searching eyes. Are you certain you are prepared to be king, my son? This is not a game for the faint of heart. Once you sit upon the Iron Throne, all of Westeros becomes your responsibility. You must hold it together, stave off rebellion, see to the well-being of the people, and keep the lords in line. Mace took a deep breath. He remembered how the realm had nearly collapsed under the Baratheons, the Targaryens before them, the endless line of kings who thought swords and gold alone could rule. I will be a good king, he said quietly. With your counsel, with Marjorie and my sons at my side, I will seek to heal the realm. Our banners speak of growing strong. Let us help Westeros grow strong again, after all this war. Olenna's hard expression softened fractionally. She nodded. Very well, let us do this. On the day of the High Septon's address, the sun rose bright and warm over King's Landing. Street criers spread word that the High Septon would offer prayers and a sermon at midday, inviting all to attend. The city stirred with anticipation. Mace Tyrell and his family, dressed in their finest attire, donned their house colors. Loras, in his Kingsguard whites, looked every inch the shining knight. Marjorie wore a flowing gown the color of fresh spring leaves. Olenna, as always, wore a simpler headdress, but with delicate gold stitching. They made their way to the Great September, which loomed above the masses. The square outside was packed with people, the air alive with murmurs. Mace noticed gold cloaks posted at intervals. Many of them nodded discreetly at him. Further off, Lannister guards stood in clumps, tense, uncertain. Joffrey was not present yet, nor was Cersei, but Tyrion lurked near the front, his mismatched eyes sweeping over the crowd. Tywin was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he thought this gathering unimportant, or perhaps he was planning his own move. At midday precisely, the High Septon emerged onto the steps, flanked by acolytes holding the 7-pointed star banners. He lifted his arms, and a hush fell across the crowd. Faithful of King's Landing, he began, his voice amplified by the hush. We gather to give thanks to the Seven for sparing this city from destruction. We gather to pray for peace, for plenty, and for justice. He went on, extolling the virtues of compassion and wisdom, naming greed and tyranny as the great sins that pulled men from the light of the Seven. Then, at last, he came to the crux of the sermon. There are times when a realm needs not merely a king in name, but a king who embodies the virtues of the faith, who guides his people with a gentle hand and a just mind. We pray that the rightful king, whosoever he be, shall rise for the good of all. The crowd began to stir, glancing at one another. Mace felt his heart pound. Was the High Septon about to name him outright? That might be the spark that lit the fire of revolution. But then came a sudden commotion. The mass of people parted, gold cloaks pushing them aside. At once, Mace saw Joffrey, marching forward, flanked by Cersei and a detachment of Lannister men. Tywin's standard-bearer accompanied them. Joffrey's face was twisted in anger. He strode up the steps toward the High Septon, ignoring the shocked gasps and bowed heads. You dare stand here, spouting riddles about a rightful king? Joffrey snapped. I am your king. How dare you question my right to the throne? Cersei's voice cut like a whip. High Septon, you risk inciting unrest. The crown does not take kindly to threats. Fear flickered across the High Septon's features, but he tried to stand his ground. Your Grace, I merely preach the words of the Seven. Joffrey lashed out. Silence, or I'll have your tongue. He rounded on the crowd, his voice carrying through the square. Do any of you doubt my claim? Let them speak, so I might punish their treason at once. A stunned silence fell. Mace could feel the mood shift dangerously. Some onlookers began to mutter curses against Joffrey. Others simply backed away. The gold cloaks loyal to the Tyrells tensed, uncertain of whether to intervene. Loras, standing near the steps, stared at Joffrey with horror. Mace realized this might be the moment. They had planned a more orderly approach, but Joffrey's outburst was turning the people against him right here, right now. If Mace remained silent, the momentum might be lost, or Joffrey might do something drastic like arrest the High Septon. Gathering his courage, Mace stepped forward, raising his voice. "Your Grace," he said, but the crowd hushed at his tone. "The High Septon only speaks of the virtues of the faith. There is no reason to threaten him. We are all your loyal subjects." But Joffrey whirled on Mace, face red with rage. "You, Lord Tyrell, have encouraged these rumors that some other king might lay claim. My mother warned me. You think your bread and flowers will win you the throne." He snatched his sword from its scabbard, pointing it at Mace. "You traitor!" A collective gasp swept the square. Loras took a step forward, uncertain. Cersei's eyes lit with a cruel satisfaction. Tyrell guards near the back began pushing through the crowd, moving to protect their lord. Mace's blood thundered in his ears. This was the crossroads. He could kneel and beg forgiveness, or he could step into the light of open rebellion. Recalling the scorn in Tywin's eyes, the cruelty in Joffrey's, and the careful counsel of his own mother and children, Mace drew himself up and spoke in a voice that carried across the steps. "A traitor is he who spills the blood of his own subjects and starves them. A traitor is he who threatens the faith. A traitor is he who sits the throne without virtue or mercy." His gaze swept over the crowd. "This realm needs a true king, one who grows strong from the love of his people, not fear. The Tyrells have fed you all. We have shown we care for your suffering. And if the king sees that as treason, then let all who hear me judge for themselves." An explosive murmur rippled through the square. Cersei's face contorted in fury. Joffrey, trembling, lunged forward with his sword. "Guards, arrest him. Strike him down." In that instant, the gold cloaks who had been bribed by the Tyrells hesitated, and many refused to obey. Instead, they turned upon the Lannister guards. Tywin's banner-bearer shouted, "Stop them!" But confusion reigned. The crowd surged, some fleeing, some chanting the Tyrell name. Loras unsheathed his own blade, moving swiftly to stand between Joffrey and Mace, though the oath of the Kingsguard warred within him. Joffrey's sword slashed wildly, missing Loras's face by inches. "You!" he screamed at Loras, spittle flying. "I command you to cut him down." Loras's eyes met Joffrey's, and for a heartbeat time froze. Then he drew himself up. "I am sworn to protect the king." But his voice trembled with the memory of Renly, of the horrors inflicted by this monstrous boy. In the next breath, he turned his blade aside, as though refusing to fulfill the order. A Lannister guard lunged at Mace. Loras sprang into motion, parrying the blow to defend his father. More Tyrell guards burst onto the steps, clashing with Lannister men. The High Septon stumbled back, seized by acolytes who shielded him. All around, the square erupted into chaos. Mace pressed forward, heart pounding. Over the din, he shouted, "People of King's Landing, hear me. I, Mace Tyrell, declare that Joffrey Baratheon has forfeited his right to rule through his cruelty and tyranny. Let all men of good conscience stand with the Tyrells for the sake of the realm." A roaring cheer broke from some in the crowd. Others looked on in terror. Cersei tried to drag Joffrey away, yelling at the Lannister guards to clear a path. Loras advanced on Joffrey, blade at the ready but uncertain. Garland sprang up the steps to help, while Marjorie and Olenna remained behind the Tyrell guards, the older woman shielding Marjorie with her own body. In the scramble, Joffrey raised his sword again, screeching, "I am the king! The king!" But a wave of gold cloaks parted to reveal Ser Garland, who seized Joffrey's sword arm in a swift motion. Loras, breathing hard, pinned Joffrey's shoulders. The boy king kicked and screamed, but he was held fast. Cersei lunged, nails bared, only to be restrained by two Tyrell men. Tyrion Lannister, who had slipped into the crowd, looked on with shock and dismay. Mace ascended the final step, looking down at Joffrey. "You have inflicted terror on this city for too long," he declared. "The rightful king is he who fosters peace, prosperity, and unity. You have shown none of these qualities. Joffrey spat at him. You're nothing but up-jumped stewards. You. He choked off as Loras twisted his arm behind his back. From somewhere in the square, a shout went up. Long live King Mace! Long live the Tyrells! Others began to echo the cry. Long live the Tyrells! The name swept the crowd like a rising tide. Cersei shrieked, Tywin will kill you all for this. But her words sounded desperate, drowned out by the roars of the gathering throng. Mace steeled himself, glancing around. He saw Lannister guards pinned or outnumbered by the gold cloaks and Tyrell men who had sided with him. The people, emboldened by the Tyrell bread and Marjorie's kindness, shouted in approval. Overhead, the sun glinted on the Seven statue. He raised his arms for silence. Hear me, I proclaim Joffrey Baratheon deposed. He shall be confined under guard until a trial may be held. The crown of Westeros passes to House Tyrell, by the will of the people and the blessing of the faith. His voice echoed, his heart in his throat. This was the moment of no return. A roar of voices rose, many cheering, some still fearful. Loras and Garland half-dragged Joffrey away. Cersei continued to scream, calling for Tywin, but Tywin was nowhere in sight. Likely he had not expected things to escalate so quickly. Mace Tyrell stood at the top of the Great September Steps, inhaling the swirl of victory and the tang of conflict in the air. Beneath him, thousands of small folk gazed up, many with hope in their eyes, hope that a new reign might spare them from further misery. Among the Tyrell banners that were hastily raised, Marjorie looked on with a faint smile, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. Olenna watched, her chin lifted in quiet triumph. And so, without a crown on his head, but with a city in his grasp, Mace Tyrell claimed the throne post-Blackwater. The Golden Rose had risen above the Lion in King's Landing, and though battles and treacheries surely awaited, in that shining moment on the steps of the Great September, the people welcomed a new king, one who promised them bread instead of blood and mercy instead of terror. No one, not even Mace Tyrell, fully knew what trials would come next. Tywin Lannister remained a looming threat, Stannis still clung to his cause, the North had its own king, and across the sea, the embers of House Targaryen stirred. Yet the hour belonged to House Tyrell, who had seized the opportunity to bloom in the ashes of war. The cheers reverberated around the sept, and the realm took its first trembling steps into a future in which the Golden Rose would press its claim upon the Iron Throne, come what may.